record this so the folks that can't join us tonight will be able to watch it later.
All right, am I the host now?
No,
Oh,
I had
okay.
to start recording first.
All right.
Make host. It should make you the host now.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick introduction of Stacey Dowling, who is our guest speaker. I've known Stacey we've worked together for quite a number of years now. She's one of the counselors that accepts our Victim Quick Response program clients that receive funding for counseling through the Ministry of the Attorney General. Stacey's been in the field of mental health and addictions for 21 years, having left the public sector to the private sector in 2017. She's a mom of 2 boys, aged 14 and 10, and she lives in the community that she works in, which is Napanee. She's a psychotherapy, she opened her psychotherapy practice in Napanee, and she seeks clients from all walks of life. She is a certified EMDR practitioner and a trauma-informed therapist. I've been passionate about compassion fatigue and became a trainer 8 years ago. So welcome, Stacey. Thanks for taking your evening to share or speak with us about compassion fatigue and proper debriefing. Stacey has a few topics that we've chatted about that she's going to go over with. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to her. Stacey doesn't mind if you have questions, if you just want to unmute yourself, this being interactive is totally okay. I'll watch the chat, and if there's questions that pop in there, I can unmute myself if you don't feel comfortable asking. But if you want to, it's totally fine for this to be engaging and people asking questions as she goes.
Perfect. Thanks, Stella. So yes, of course, anytime you have a question, if there's anything that comes up, I can't see the chat. So yeah, definitely interject at any point. And I like any kind of interaction is great. However, I am okay with it being quiet too, because I teach at St. Lawrence College and I am getting quite comfortable just talking and hoping people are there. So either way, whatever your comfort is, I will also leave lots of time at the end for any kind of questions that you might have. So what we're going to focus on today is I have done a presentation or completed a presentation for you on compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. What I'm going to do is I'm also weaving in kind of some of the unique aspects of what COVID has also done for us in the last year, kind of compounding some of the issues that we're all experiencing in all of our different ways. So how we start is kind of just to look at victim services reality. Being a victim service worker, and for presentation, I understand you guys are volunteers, team leads, and so the understanding is that you guys are not going out for anything that is going to be happy. It is all sadness, it's loss, there's trauma, there's impact. So we have to remember that in this kind of service, the likelihood of coming across really, really, really harsh, sad realities is the experience. So we prepare ourselves for that. And I think that part of this presentation is to kind of help go along with that, to be able to, because you guys are not unaware of what you're working in. It's the kind of the next step. What next? What can you do to kind of make sure that you're taking care of yourself, making sure that you're kind of watching your own abilities to manage the very sad, traumatic experiences that you may be a part of. So when we look at victim services in general and kind of beyond that, we are working with the sad realities of our community environment. Very often in times when you're called out to a situation, you're experiencing and listening to traumatic stories, experiencing somebody's loss, you're providing support in people's worst times at times. The hard part about that too is that right now we have a deeply compromised system. I think what we're hearing is that goes across all different kinds of environments. It goes beyond just the social service environment. It's going into the nursing environments, the hospital environments, all of the deeply rooted societal programs. And we're finding a lack of services. We're finding a lack of supports. The systems are quite compromised. So this kind of layers another challenge for us in the work environment. We also have ongoing challenges and cutbacks. And now we're having a layer of social isolation. So we're having situations that you're coming into to encounter that potentially we have aspects of social isolation and COVID challenges that you're experiencing. So I know being a service provider, a counseling provider for victim services, I am seeing a drastic increase of domestic violence, and a lot of situations where the safety planning is a real challenge. There's a lot of barriers in place. We have a lack of kind of housing providers. We have a very, very compromised shelter system right now that is not really functioning as, you know, a warm, welcoming embrace with all of the COVID safety protocols, which are necessary and needed. We just have to remember that all of the services are feeling a bit different. And I think that that's having aspects on the people that are working within them. So when we look at compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, we have to take a step back and look at this from kind of a broad stroke. So when we look at compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, it really is it affects almost all people that are in high touch professions. It really affects those that are helpers. So we see it amongst healthcare providers. We see it in the mental health and addiction field, first responders, fire, ambulance, law enforcement, educators, volunteers. We have to remember as well that although we focus a lot of our energy on the people that are like the high touch, the first responders, and the people that are right in first contact with trauma, loss, we also have to remember our clerical and support staff, the people that are maybe taking the first call. Maybe sometimes it's just simply the dispatch. These people also are highly affected by vicarious trauma. And then we also have vulnerable subgroups with high trauma exposure, such as our child protection workers, our ER departments, and those that are caregivers for family members. So what this really says is that although we are kind of doing this inward focus about how this might be impacting us, it also kind of helps us with our navigations in the service provider field. So looking at our helping professionals and seeing through the eyes of maybe the first responders and seeing maybe the impacts of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue in their everyday work. It's having that kind of general scope will give us kind of tools to move us forward. So before we kind of get into the what do we do about it, we need to know more about what it is. So vicarious trauma is that repeated exposure to difficult stories, and this really changes our views of the world. It can cause nightmares, difficulty getting certain images out of our head, a lot of preoccupation. So we might replay a story we've heard or kind of go back to an event that we have shown up to, and we're going to replay that in our mind every time we close our eyes or whenever we have a quiet time. These things can become quite disruptive in our everyday life, especially because often when we're working in high trauma environments or environments where there's not a lot of preparation for what you're walking into, we sometimes go in, the images capture in our mind or the story captures in our mind, and we end up just replaying it. We often don't do what we need to do to kind of help ourselves to move forward. So one way to kind of take a look at this is through this quote: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched is as realistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So what I always want to remind everybody, especially in these high touch environments where we are exposed to trauma, we're exposed to the loss, as opposed to wondering if you're going to be affected by vicarious trauma or if you're going to feel compassion fatigue, let's just kind of move that aside and just say, I will be, and let's start working through that. So I always say to anybody that is in a helping environment, it's super important to just not say if, say when, and start to work towards kind of that development and skill building and the self-care that we need so that when you start to launch into that and start to feel the symptoms, you're already well ahead of kind of the fold, so that you don't fall and end up working towards that burnout sensation. So what is compassion fatigue? So compassion fatigue is that deep erosion of our compassion. It's the ability to tolerate strong emotions in difficult stories and others. And what we do is when we start to have compassion fatigue, we no longer are able to kind of sit and work through and listen to people's stories in the same way. We start to erode in our compassion. And this can actually start to happen, not just in our professional life with clients, but can start to impact our personal lives as well. I always found that in my career, especially when I was in a really intense program where I was a crisis worker, my compassion fatigue often would come through, not so much with clients. I would notice it more in my home life. I had much less tolerance and patience for the people around me. I felt like I was giving so much in my work environment that by the time I came home, if anybody needed anything more from me, I was on probably my last nerve. And I started to really see that as compassion fatigue became something quite familiar. So just to kind of bring you it as an inside look into compassion fatigue and how I kind of started on this journey of training and insight, it actually came from a bit of a slippery slope for myself. It was after working in the addiction mental health field for about 20 years. And I was on a team that was quite poisonous. I reflect back on it now and still shake my head how long that I withstood kind of the environment that I was working in. But this team that I worked in, we were dealing with high intense trauma day in, day out. We were going out to suicides. We were going out to really horribly vulnerable situations for clients. And we never really had the end result. We were just the ones going. And so we never actually were able to really feel like we were all finishing any of the situations. What ended up happening was each day in our team meetings, because we met every morning, every night, those meetings became very, very ugly. Our team, myself included, began talking about anybody that walked by. If you walked into the room, you better watch out because the target was on your back. It became a very poisonous environment. And I really didn't know. I kind of wanted to be part of it because I felt like if I was part of it, then I wasn't going to be the target, I think. Until one day I went to go on my lunch break, go into the lunchroom that we all went into, and my heart started to pound. And I didn't really understand why. I decided to go for a walk. And while I was walking, I came to this realization that I was not being a person that I couldn't even recognize myself. So as I walk, and it just kind of, this whole situation almost seems idealistic, but it's honestly what happened. As I walked, I went down to the library, so downtown Kingston, to the public library. I happened to just walk by the building and happened to see a sign. And what I saw was little bullets on the thing that says, "Are you struggling? Do you feel like you're at the end of your rope?" It was all these things. And it was the very first advertisement for a compassion fatigue workshop held by Francois Mathieu and Robin Westphal. I don't even know how many years ago. It was the very first one. We were in the library and it screamed at me. That day was kind of the game changer for me. I ended up going 6 weeks later to this workshop and realized that what I was experiencing was a high level of compassion fatigue. So with the knowledge that I gained from that workshop, it became kind of the game changer of the way that I worked in the field for the subsequent 12 years after I stayed there. And it really did change kind of my direction in my career as well. It made me look towards management at a certain point because I really wanted to support the staff in a way that I felt like I needed many times over through my career. So who gets compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma? I think we all do. I think that's the simple answer. I think we all do. And what's even more is oftentimes, and especially for volunteers, for team leads, this is probably not your primary job. Many of you do this on top of a full-time job, or do this kind of in unison with other work. And many times what we find is we create role overload. So we have to be really mindful of that, that we end up taking on a whole lot, too many competing demands, too many roles, and we don't have enough time. And all of a sudden things start to kind of spiral. It makes us a little more prone to compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. A really, really, really great book is by Linda Duxbury, and there's a bunch of resources at the end that I will share in a printout. But Linda Duxbury found that 3 out of 5 healthcare workers, and people, that's a broad scope, were suffering from role overload. That being said, what ends up happening is the more that we do, the more roles we have, the less we're putting attention to the needs of the self. So that's where the attention really needs to find itself. Because if we don't, we end up leading ourselves down the path to burnout. Burnout is kind of when compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma finally do the KO punch. It wins. And we burn out. That's after the chronicity, acuity, and complexity is perceived way beyond the capacity of the service provider. It can affect many healthcare professionals, but not necessarily mean our views of the world are damaged or that we've lost the ability to be compassionate for others. It just makes us more vulnerable. So what we end up doing is we have no further of a fight. We're done. And sometimes when we lose the fight in us, we become so vulnerable to every single impact around us. And this is something that I used to look for a lot when I was managing staff, is I was looking for signs of compassion fatigue. I was looking for signs of vicarious trauma. I was really looking for signs of burnout, because these people were the ones that often were becoming very vulnerable. And they became quite obvious to me the more I did work around compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. So what did I often look for? What do I look for in myself? A lot of the things that we highlight are some of the physical symptoms. A lot of the time what we do is, because what we do is we are exposed to all of these traumatic events, and what we're not doing is we're not taking the time to properly debrief, to properly look at the situation and acknowledge the impacts of each scenario that we go through. Each situation that has a traumatic impact or a loss involved is really, it's important to sometimes just say, it's not, again, should I debrief or should I get support? It should be a normalized response. We need to be able to at least collaborate with someone, even for a few seconds, to just find that common ground. And that becomes something that I will go into a little bit further once we get to some strategies. But what we look for in the workplace is when people are not properly addressing some of the compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma symptoms or signs, what we start to see is the body. The body starts to tell us the story. A lot of the time, the body will just start to show us very interesting little signs about ourselves, such as physical exhaustion. So that is one that is often, it's hard to figure out. Is it because I'm not sleeping? What is it because? But if you are feeling extraordinarily exhausted and you're coming home and you have nothing left in the tank, this might be a sign or symptom of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. Insomnia or hypersomnia. So either sleeping all the time or not being able to sleep at all. Headaches and migraines, increased susceptibility to hypochondria or to illness or somatization or hypochondria. I know for myself, with physical signs, I always am looking, and that's what I always do, is that's a really good way. It's a window into myself. I'm always looking for little signs of my own physical well-being. I'm a person that has been able to indicate in myself that if I start getting cankers and cold sores, that's usually a very good idea for me that something's not going well for me. I am either not getting enough rest, maybe I'm working too hard, maybe I'm fighting off illness. So it's really important for me to kind of get a heads up for myself and to begin to start listening to myself. I like to use the analogy of the feather, the brick, and the dump truck. So a lot of the time with physical symptoms, they often come in like a feather. So all of a sudden, for myself, I might get a cold sore or canker sore. For other people, they might get a sore throat, or they might get some kind of low level sign or symptom of not feeling well. But what we often do is when we're in the midst of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, we ignore that. We let that feather dust us over. We just keep on pushing. We sometimes start to add a little bit more on because we think, I just got to fight through this. Then we get hit by the brick. My brick usually, and back in the workforce, my brick was often bronchitis. I was the person that when my system was down, I didn't just get a cold, I got good old bronchitis. I would be down and out. I remember back years ago, I got a bout of bronchitis. My doctor had said I needed to be off. She had suggested it. I think it was a Wednesday. I went to see her. I got put on antibiotics. She wanted me to be off for a week because I really needed that rest. What did I do? I ended up back to work on the Friday. And what ended up happening is I passed out at work and had to be taken out on a stretcher, and I was diagnosed with pneumonia. That was my dump truck moment. I was out of work for a solid 2 weeks, flat on my back, sicker than I had ever been in my life. I really feel like if I had have just backed things up and really paid attention to the first kind of feather moments, just those low level symptoms, or even listen, goodness, like even allowing myself to listen to the brick moment where the bronchitis, go home, stay home, I probably wouldn't have been where I was with a really severe case of pneumonia. So we also want to be watching for behavioral signs and symptoms. So often looking for increased use of alcohol and drugs. So this was really an interesting thing that I was always listening for when I was managing the teams that I was managing. I was managing, I think, 7 teams at one time. And what I was listening for a lot, not that I was being judgmental or anything, but the people that were talking about, can't wait to get home, I need to have a drink, or the shopping, the gambling, some of these behavioral addictions, a lot of the time what we look for or what we see is people are on a quest to numb the vicarious trauma or the compassion fatigue. We also see a lot of anger and irritability that comes about. So we have nothing left in the tank. So what we have is just that outward projection to back people up. There's an exaggerated sense of responsibility. So I used to see this a lot in one of the teams that I managed, that there was one person on the team that I knew she wasn't doing well when all of a sudden she started taking responsibility for everything and anything that she could. So she would be in a team meeting and I'd be asking for support with something or asking for a little help with something, and she would take everything on. So it was this exaggerated sense of responsibility that she would, and that would usually be a good warning sign for me to start to talk to her about how she was doing, how she was coping at work, how she was managing, how was she taking care of her self-care. Looking for absenteeism. So a lot of the times we often in workplaces, we look at absenteeism as kind of a performance issue, which it certainly can be. But a lot of the time, absenteeism is really an indicator of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. So taking that lens in the leadership role that I was in and looking at time off as not so much looking at the person as being avoidant, but seeing if they needed something, if there was some needs they had, anything that they needed more at work. Avoidance of clients. So people that start making appointments with clients, canceling clients, just because they haven't got any more gas in the tank. An impaired ability to make decisions. So what you sometimes see is people that end up looking for validation and confirmation of decision making when they're very actually able to make these decisions, but they just don't have the confidence in themselves anymore. That can be a really big sign of compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. Forgetfulness, problems with intimacy and or in personal relationships, attrition, people that just start to fall away from positions, they start leaving positions, compromised care for clients. So clients often are the silent sufferers of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, because we often have clients that no longer have the worker that has a full tank of gas. The person is maybe cutting corners, maybe a little less patient, not able to kind of work with some of the challenges that they might be facing. And then we often will see a silencing response. That's a person that just has nothing left and just silently sits in situations with that awkward kind of silence response. There's no engagement on the other end. This can be a really strong sign. There's also physiological symptoms that you can see that come through when we are looking for vicarious trauma within ourselves or within others. There's distancing. So we don't have a lot left for engaging with friends, family, colleagues. I mean, for me, I think that what my physiological symptom was when I was starting to really not do well at work was I couldn't spend another lunchtime with these people. And what I was finding is I was getting so overwhelmed thinking about sitting with them. It also meant that on the weekends, I didn't really want to see anybody. If my phone rang at home, I had nothing left in the tank to answer. I didn't want to answer the phone. I was answering crisis lines all day. Last thing I wanted to do was listen to somebody on the other end of the phone. I was emotionally exhausted. I had nothing, no emotional kind of abilities to manage anything. I had a really negative self-image. So at that point, when I was in a really low spot, I really was not feeling great about the work that I was doing. It didn't matter how compassionate I was with people. I just felt like I was never doing enough for the clients. I think depression is a really common symptom that we see, and that reduced ability to feel empathy or sympathy. So this was a really strong one where it kind of scared me a little bit because I started to feel that I couldn't empathize anymore. I had this really kind of almost a block of empathy where I wasn't allowing myself to really understand what a person was going through. And I did this presentation several years ago for Family and Children's Services. And during the presentation, this was the one thing that somebody stopped the presentation and wanted to ask me some questions. And the question they asked was, do you think this is why when I hear about horrible things that have happened to children, inside my head, that little voice goes, oh, for God's sakes, and minimizes the situation? She said, even though what the children had experienced was horrible, she said her empathy, she just could no longer kind of experience the situation in the way that she felt was right. So that becomes a really strong indicator. Cynicism or embitterment. Cynicism, that was a strong quality. Everything that happened in our lunchroom, anything that anybody was talking about, any new policy, any new initiative that was brought up at work was going to be a failure. We didn't have hope for anything. Resentment is a strong statement. This is one that you can kind of watch for in any of your workplaces, is the must be nice philosophy. A person that is really struggling is looking at everybody and going, must be nice. So if you talk about, oh, I went to the gym this morning, must be nice. Oh, I went out for dinner. And I think we're getting this almost with COVID now, is anybody that's doing anything more than sitting in their home, that becomes sometimes the statement you're hearing, must be nice. Feelings of professional helplessness. I think that this is a really common feeling at times, is that feeling that no matter what we do, it's not going to help anyway. So I know experiencing with people with domestic violence, there becomes this strong feeling of helplessness. When we're trying to help people, we're really putting all of our efforts into trying to make a really good plan of support the next day or next week, or setting them up with a therapist. All the while, you know that the possible outcome will be they go back to the partner that was abusive. The diminished sense of enjoyment in the career. So sometimes this can happen. We start to no longer really enjoy the career we're in, or enjoy the day-to-day interactions. That I actually can remember, because I remember saying to myself, during that time when I really was struggling, that I used to be really giddy going to work. I used to love work. I actually really, really loved my job. I was one of those people that people would eye roll at because I really loved what I was doing. And when I was really kind of in a depth of compassion fatigue, I no longer was excited for work. I actually was only looking for Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I dreaded Mondays. And that was a real change for me. And then there was a strong sense of depersonalization. I just was kind of pushing myself away from everything. I didn't see myself as part of anything. So, in light of all of those signs and symptoms, one really good strategy to kind of think about is kind of looking at all of those signs and symptoms from your own perspective and taking a look at some of the warning signs. When we look at all of the symptoms we experience, we look at trying to find a place like that snapshot of, when am I doing really well? What does my life look like? What am I doing? Am I going to the gym every morning or going to the gym 3 times a week? Am I having a shower before I go to work? Do I change my clothes when I get home and put on something different just to kind of change my kind of everything about how I feel? Am I putting on music? What are the things that make me tick and make me feel good? What are my yellow warning signs? So this is a really important consideration, is trying to identify what are some of your warning signs. For me, my warning signs are definitely the cold sores, the canker sores, the cynicism, starting to feel that pit in your stomach going to work. What are your own yellow signs? So what are the things that make you say, uh-oh, maybe I am experiencing some compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, or maybe I need to put some strategies in place for myself? And then what is the red? What are your stop, going no further, need to take a break, need to take some time off symptoms and signs? So this is a really good way just to kind of put into your head kind of some ways to really do some personal reflection about yourself. So prevention, is this possible? And I think the question is, it's not really whether stress will appear and take its toll on us as clinicians. Instead, it is to what extent professionals take the essential steps to appreciate, limit, and learn from this very stress. And we want to be able to deepen our personal lives in our roles as helpers and healers. So it really is about, the prevention is really taking a serious look at the role as a helper, and not just seeing it as, oh, it's just my volunteer job, or this is just my team lead job, or whatever. This is a really important job. This is a really important job that in your time of response, you may be the person that helps a person through their hardest moments. So we can't take that lightly. And what we need to do is kind of see ourselves as a really integral part of a person's traumatic experiences, and also that person that is going to need to be strong for that person, but also really appreciate the impacts that has on yourself as the helper in that situation. So how do we address compassion to fatigue and trauma? So we really need to look at strategy number 1. That's taking stock. So it's tracking all your stressors at work and at home. So one of the exercises I do in a full day workshop, so I've done a couple of these full day workshops, and we spend time on the taking stock activity. And I ask people to look at making a bullseye for themselves. So putting themselves in the center of the bullseye, looking at all of the things that they're responsible for at home, at work, for their children, for their family, for their workplace, for their parents, for anything. So all of these things go on a big plate, so you can do it on a plate or what have you. And you really want to take stock of all the stressors at home and at work. And then we look at what's not happening. Are there things on that plate that really are not necessary? Or are there things that could be just shifted a little bit? This becomes a really strong exercise in self-care when we put ourselves in a place where we say, all of these things are on there. I feel like I have to do all of them, but what can I kind of wiggle? So this is one of those really good strategies to take a look at. And I do this a lot with clients one-on-one, especially when I'm working with helpers in the or healthcare systems or the helping field. Another thing that we want to look at is work-life balance. So really taking a good idea to make sure that we are reducing some of the aspects of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. And what we find is that if there's a really strong social support, both at home and at school. So this also lends itself to that critical incident debriefing. So being able to have a person, whether you respond in pairs and having that a very intentional debrief about what's going on. I also think about some of the situations you guys go out on. It's those moments of reflection when you come back after you've maybe been to a sudden death or something very traumatic for a family, and you do everything you can and you sit and go, did I do enough? These are really, really important times to just be able to remember the important aspects of critical incident debriefing. And I went away to a several day workshop, and really the biggest message to me about that was, in terms of critical incident debriefing, the only thing that we need to do for people in their most serious times of trauma or loss is to validate and normalize their experiences and their responses. So whether it's anger, it's normalizing the experience of anger. It's normalizing the feeling of grief. It's normalizing that overwhelmed feeling and giving them a sense of permission to just feel those feelings. So critical incident debriefing can be really, really important just in the philosophy of what you do with the client, but also then coming back and away from that situation and just spending a few minutes with someone else, being able to just validate what you've done, or validating for each other kind of the work you've done, and recognizing kind of, regardless of how it goes, your presence, even if it's silent and not knowing a whole lot of what to say, can mean a lot in a very, very traumatic time. Another key strategy to reduce compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma in helping professionals is to find areas where you can increase your self-control. So finding areas where you either put into effect a walking program. I'm going to walk 3 times a week for 20 minutes. So finding areas where you take on initiative and control. These have been proven to be really effective in kind of self-care and strategy. Having good self-care. So making sure you're taking the time for the things that you really enjoy. What we often let go, especially when we're stressed or we're not doing well, is the things that take care of us. We give every last bit of our own abilities to somebody else. What we need to do is remember that the importance of our own self-care is going to come on and affect everybody around us. So very often in my own life, I know that for me, if I don't go on the treadmill for 45 minutes every morning, 7 days a week, I'm not going to be giving my best to everybody. It's just something that I have really realized over the years, that I need that 45 minutes for myself every single morning. And that really kind of lends itself to, once I do that in the morning, I've taken care of myself and I'm able to kind of give to everybody, especially in my therapy job where I see people day in and day out who need my professional kind of help. They need the best of me. So when I take care of myself in the morning, I'm able to bring that. You need a really good work-life balance, making sure that you take the time to have some time off, making sure that you are okay with taking, if you have mental health time, some agencies have mental health time. Sometimes it's just sick time. Sometimes it's really just dedicating a day for the self and being okay with that, or taking vacation time and using it in the way that you need it. You want to really make sure that you reflect on your job satisfaction. Are you in a job that you really value and you like? Is this something important to you? Is this really filling your tank? Sometimes it's looking at caseloads and workload reductions. So I know that back when I was a case manager, many times I would have to really look at caseloads. Um, and there would be times when I would have an imbalance of my caseload. And it was really empowering for me when I could go to my manager and say, I know I'm the next one up for the new case, but I'm asking for a buy. I have 3 or 4 clients that are really unwell. Now, I had a really good manager that allowed us to do that. Um, but it just sometimes empowered me just enough for a couple days just to get myself back together. Sometimes it's looking at workload reduction if that's something possible. Being able to look at all the tasks that are assigned, and is there something that could be done differently? Is there anything that could be managed in a way that maybe takes some of the time away? Limiting your trauma inputs. So this is often an interesting thing. I find that um, when we work in fields of trauma or trauma responses or heavy helping environments, we often are the people that are loving the special victims unit, law and order show. We're kind of enmeshing ourselves in the trauma after the trauma. And I used to do that. I used to be obsessed with crime dramas. I just lived in, and then all of a sudden, for some reason, when I left my career, I think it was maybe when I did my master's degree, I remember watching Precious, the movie Precious, and I couldn't watch it. I had just kind of distanced myself for a little bit from trauma inputs and recognizing that a lot of my job day to day is about people's trauma. I try to really limit all the other trauma inputs that I expose myself to. So I'm not a person that will sit down and watch a movie if it's a traumatic movie. If it's about child loss, somebody getting killed, murdered, anything like that, forget it. I'm not watching it. So I really limit those trauma inputs just to maintain and manage my ability to be a, kind of a worker that is not feeling vicariously traumatized day to day. Accept or accessing coaching, counseling, and good clinical supervision. Again, I can't stress this enough. The importance of just simply sharing experiences, sharing what it feels like to go out to a traumatic event, going out to somebody's worst moments, and then you walk away and there's not a lot of closure. So having somebody just to have 5, 10, 15 minutes just to kind of wrap it up and be able to kind of put it into a place where you've put some closure to it. The value of that is so important. Good clinical supervision. So meeting with people on or a clinical supervisor, that to me is probably my favorite hour of my month, is meeting with my clinical supervisor and just going through a few of my cases. Sometimes it's just validating I'm on the right track. Sometimes it's asking some of those things that I just really don't know and feeling safe in being wrong. That has been really, really important. And attending regular professional development and ongoing training. Again, I think this is something so important and something that we often undervalue, is how important it is for us to continue to keep doing training and going and getting some extra training. I can't even tell you how many CBT trainings I've attended over my years in mental health and addictions, but I still go and I pick, even if I feel like some of it's repetitious, I will find a few take home messages. And it always puts a little bounce in my step because I feel like I've done something for myself. A really effective strategy in reducing vicarious trauma is low impact debriefing. So this is really important, especially for the fact that many times what you're going out to is somebody's worst moment. It is somebody's trauma. And we have to remember that everybody has a threshold. So low impact disclosure is trying to stay away from sliming people. Sliming people is just dropping a traumatic story on somebody without any warning and without any kind of parameters. It's just the story, detail by detail. And when I worked in the crisis field, the gorier the story, the more detailed you could make it. We used to slime each other every day, all day. The more gory, the more gruesome, the more detailed it could be, the better it was. And what we realized is I would start hearing and thinking about stories when I was driving home at night. It was really important that that was one of the effective strategies that we had to put into place. So how do you low impact debrief? First, it's about having that self-awareness. So a lot of the time, if you have to go into a trauma situation or you have to share your traumatic situation, there's a lot of information and research that has talked about self-awareness. So when you go into a traumatic environment, so if there was a sudden death, just how your posture is, kind of the way you stand. Posturing is something really important. For myself, when I'm seeing a new client and I know they're from victim services and there's been quite a horrific situation and they're coming to me for counseling, I'm very aware of the way I'm sitting. I try to like relax myself a little bit so I'm able to take the story in. I also ask the client with how they tell me the story. I want just little increments. So I will kind of ease them into the story. This is also really important when you are debriefing with someone, is giving somebody fair warning, saying, I just want to share with you about the call I just went out on last night or the call I got. And it's very traumatic and it's about a child. Are you in a good place to be able to hear it? So it's about getting consent and giving fair warning to the person that you're going to give information. And then just doing that low impact disclosure means just turning the valve just a little bit, giving a little bit, and allowing the person you're talking to guide that conversation. Many times when I was a manager, I was the manager of crisis, everybody would come to me for debriefing. And many times I maybe had been debriefed 3 times already that morning, and I'm having someone come to me at 2. And I used to always encourage all of my staff to ask, give me fair warning and ask my consent. And I used to ask for everybody to do this with each other so that I had permission to be able to say, you know what, I really want to hear what you have to say, but I've heard a lot of traumatic stuff today. So I'm just wondering if we can just ease ever so gently into the story and I can kind of guide it with what I need to know, just so that I don't end up having to wear the story as well. A lot of the time, what clients don't, or what staff don't need, we don't need to give all of the dirty details right down to the nitty gritty. We just need to kind of give the surface level and get the support we need. A lot of the times it's just validating that we did the right things. So this is a really, really important thing, I think, that can be applied both by somebody that needs to listen to a disclosure, but also when giving a disclosure. It's kind of asking and giving the fair warning with consent. Another strategy that's super important for staff and everybody involved in the helping field is just getting more training. It's never, ever being satisfied with being trained enough. I think it really is. It's one of those things where it's like filling your tank up. So getting that training, going to anything that you can. And right now with COVID, one of the great positives that I have seen over the last year is the abundance of webinars, free trainings. People have put out so many wonderful trainings over the last year that we used to have to be able to travel to go to. And now we're able to attend right in our own offices. So it's been really, really exciting for myself to kind of stumble upon probably some trainings that would have cost me a fortune to attend and to be able to be there really through the screen. I was able to attend Dr. Gabor Mate's. He did a 3-hour presentation a couple of weeks ago and I attended it online. I've seen him in person many, many times. I enjoyed it probably more so sitting, watching it on Zoom, because I had the ability to kind of move about, listen to everything he was saying, and really reflect on the material. And the 5th strategy is a really important thing that we need to kind of put into practice, and we often never give it as much attention as we should. It's the importance of creating resiliency through relaxation and stress reduction techniques. So what we want to be able to do is just really look at mindfulness, reduction, distress, like those strategies that just bring the distress down and allow us to just, as opposed to fighting feelings at time, It's just allowing yourself to be fully present without judgment or resistance. It's just allowing whatever you're feeling to kind of come up like the wave and come down. I've actually been practicing this. This is something that over the last probably 10 years, I've been practicing a lot of mind body work. I'm telling you right flat out, I am not great at it, but I'm finding myself getting more and more kind of comfortable with the techniques. Using probably one of the best things I've stumbled upon in the last year was the Calm app. So I use the Calm app a lot. Sometimes I will use the Calm app on my way home from work, just to be able to leave all of all of the stories, all of my clients in my workplace, and be able to go home with a clear mind. So I will use a Calm app just to kind of clear my mind. I do a lot of different weird rituals in between clients. So a lot of the times I will move chairs around in my office. So kind of allowing one client to leave, I move another chair in so that that story is over. So I'm able to put some closure to it. A lot of kind of weird mental stuff for myself, but it allows me to kind of be grounded and ready for the next client. There's a recommendation to use meditation, some yoga, relaxation training, and try to incorporate these into everyday life. Because what we find is they're really helpful in reducing emotional distress and managing severe physical pain. So the research around mindfulness, yoga, relaxation, all of these things, we are finding more and more research that really, really validates the effectiveness in managing high stress, high emotional distress within the self, and actually strong physical pain symptoms. So what I do is I have cards that I use as well. I use some mindfulness cards. So I've really realized with myself, I'm quite a visual learner, an auditory learner. So I can't just lay on my floor and meditate. My head's too busy for that. But if I'm guided, I can really follow along with that. And I can do a really great kind of stretch of probably 8 to 10 minutes of mindfulness. And that's really important for me. So I kind of invite you to give that a try. There's tons of stuff and resources on YouTube. So you don't even need to pay the money right away. If you want to try on YouTube, you can find just about any kind of mindfulness or meditation activity or some yoga. All of this is just about really connecting the mind and body. So what are some ways to incorporate mindfulness-based stress reduction into your life? So there's some really simple strategies of just sitting meditations. So just allowing yourself to pay attention to your breath, having yourself paying attention to any other sensory events. So touch, so maybe it's using different kinds of tactile touch and feeling different fabrics, might be using smells, a lot of aromatherapy, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, kind of spending some time with the body scan, maybe taking a look at the body from the top of your head to the tips of your toes, seeing if there's tension or tightness. A lot of the time we carry around a lot of stress and tension and we don't even know it. And until we draw our attention to it through a body scan, we're just carrying it around. Many times when I go to my massage therapist, I don't really realize until I get there and she's telling me how far up my shoulders are sitting. So when I do a body scan, I usually can kind of target the shoulders and recognize the need to kind of posture myself in a more effective way. Hatha yoga consists of stretches and postures just to enhance mindfulness and awareness. So this is a really important strategy as well, just to be able to connect in with the mind and body and recognizing the need for that peace in our minds. So what we want to be able to do is recognize that being in the field of victim services, so going out and responding to trauma or having to be a first responder, essentially, to somebody's worst moment, their own trauma or their experience of loss, what we have to do is be able to say, the likelihood of you being affected by vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue is not if, it's when. It's going to have an impact if we don't take care of ourselves. So what I want you to do is just kind of think about the presentation from today and just take a moment to think about what small change could you make today that would make this presentation benefit you as a victim services volunteer or team lead? So what is one thing that you can take away and you can either implement when you think about all the things that you have going on? What is your one takeaway? And really committing to yourself that 1% change, because that 1% change is usually just the beginning of the ball rolling. So when we make a 1% change and commit to it, we end up finding other changes will come about with that. We don't ever want to sit and wait for the motivation for change, because motivation doesn't just kind of hop upon us. We have to get started with a change process, and then the motivation follows. So that is the presentation for today. So I just wondered if there was any questions, concerns, comments. I have also left my contact information and some resources available for you if you wanted to look more in depth. The compassion fatigue workbook is probably one of the best tools I have for compassion fatigue. When I was a manager, I used to take that book and we used to do exercises. There's tons of little exercises in that book. Also, just a really great read if you were interested, and tons of great resources on the www.compassionfatigue.ca. I believe it's now called Tend Academy, but it will take you right there. So is there any questions?
Silence.
Mm-hmm.
Which is good. You're very informative, Stacey. Thank you. Do we want to, you've kind of touched on it in your presentation, but we had talked about like when you go into a critical incident, what to expect. I mean, so many, or even if we want to kind of circle back and talk more a bit about it, the common feedback I get from my volunteers when they've attended a suicide, sudden death, especially when there's no kind of practical support that you can provide, that they often leave feeling like they've done nothing, and just how people process critical incidents that while they're in them, just to kind of give the volunteers some insight into that. Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
So and I think that with critical incident debriefing, one of the best take home messages that I ever received through that training was that just being there, just having presence and having empathy. So it's that therapeutic rapport that quickly establishes when a person is in a complete traumatic event or a very sudden death or loss. What our number one expectation is to just be a presence. It's showing a calm, compassionate, empathic person who's there to kind of be with them in that moment. What we learn in critical incident debriefing is the only tools that you're using at this point is there's no magic. All you're doing is essentially normalizing the experience and validating the emotions. So one of the group, I did a critical incident debriefing in probably, I had to get therapy, or not therapy, but some debriefing. It was a child that had died suddenly, and the hospital went from, I think, 5 family members to 22 within, I don't even know. It felt like 5 minutes for me, but I was responded, and I had just finished this critical incident debriefing. And the only thing I kept saying is, that's very normal to be angry. And I just normalized and validated and normalized and validated and normalized and validated, and just stood silently and allowed people to use my presence in the way that they needed. I believe I just stood very quietly and had my hand on somebody's hand for quite a period of time. And I kept trying to question myself, what am I doing? Should I be doing more? But in that moment, when I got feedback from this family, the feedback was so interesting to me, because I walked away from that situation thinking that I didn't do much. But the family members really were able to say that my presence was calming. I just made them feel like whatever was happening in those moments were their moments, and I was normalizing their experiences. And I was just there kind of hoping to take some of the pain from them and help them through it. it really is it's a normalized response to always feel like we're not doing enough, but simply being there is, 75% of the work. The other 25% of the work is just validating empathy and normalizing experience and allowing people to just go through the grief process in the way that they are. Does that kind of answer that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I tell my volunteers, but you presented that more eloquently.
It didn't sound eloquent to me.
Did to me.
But yeah, that it's just, and I think that it's a normalized response as people that are responding to recognize that we always walk away going, oh my God, did I do enough? Did I say what I was supposed to? I hope I didn't overstep, understep, overstate, understate. I think we do that. And that's why really, really, really important to get some support after any critical incident, to just even have 2 minutes, 5 minutes with somebody else that gets it. It's so important to just be able to sometimes just say, it went really well. I was able to do this. I was able to do this. And to have somebody just affirm, you don't realize how powerful that 3, 5 minutes, 10-minute conversation can be in the processing and kind of allowing yourself to kind of fully kind of go the full circle around in terms of the processing of an event. Is there any other questions or anything that's coming up for people that they want to ask?
Something, Stacey.
Sure.
You touched on it really briefly at the beginning, but it's certainly a reality for all of us, how things are compounded with COVID. And I find, maybe I'm the only one here who's experiencing this, but I find even in my regular life, I'll look at my stresses and I'll go, well, okay, is this a normal stress? Is my reaction a normal reaction to the stressor in my life? Is there a greater level because of COVID? Am I excused in having this stress reaction or because of COVID, or am I blowing things out of proportion? So I find sometimes I'm a little confused as to what is justifiable reaction, what isn't. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that.
Sure. I think that's kind of a very similar experience for a lot of us. I think we often sit back and reflect on our experiences through COVID. I think that right now, I think it's really important that, I think sometimes we have to look at our reactions, and if somebody's giving us feedback that they're a little bit out of the context of appropriate, maybe it's time to get some support around it. However, for the most part, I think sometimes giving ourselves a little grace, not to be perfect right now, to be able to have a little bit of grace to not be perfect. I call myself a lot a humble therapist. I make a lot of mistakes. I do get impacted by the day-to-day. I think COVID has taught me a few things this year as well, but I allow myself to not present myself like the perfect therapist. So sometimes with clients, I will share that experience with them. The frustration of, oh my gosh, can we just get through this? Although on the flip of that, you're going one day at a time. We're getting there. I don't know why, but 2021 kind of flipped for me, and I'm only seeing hope in this year. There's only hope. And I think hearing that the vaccines are coming out, and I feel like, but I think that for some of 2020, I was feeling a bit dismal, and I allowed myself a little bit of grace to be that. I definitely took a lot more time off last year than I had in a long time, because I knew that it was taking a lot more for me to work than I had experienced before. So I wasn't seeing as many clients. I did have the ability to kind of limit the amount of people I was seeing in the day. I was definitely juggling my cases a lot differently. So I was making sure that I was only seeing, because domestic violence was I feel like for a while there, my caseload was 75% domestic violence. However, now I would say it's all high school students. but I was having to kind of break them up. So I wasn't seeing like 4 domestic violence in a day. So yeah, I think it's really kind of a very short answer to a very long answer is giving yourself grace, allowing yourself not to always kind of hit that realm of perfection. We're all experiencing this in the same way in some ways, and all of us are having our own individual experiences with it. And I think that we have to just normalize that nobody wrote us a book to kind of get through all of this. So we're not supposed to do this eloquently and gracefully. We need to be humble through it, and definitely not be afraid to reach out and get some extra support if you need it.
Great, thanks.
Is there any other questions?
I think on that note, Stacey, if you want to switch the host back to me.
Okay. I will. Oh, now I got to figure out how to do that. The more.
So go to participants and
right.
find my name, and then click on it, and it should say make host.
You got it. Make host. There you go. Okay.
Perfect.
There you go.
And now
Perfect.
I can stop the recording.
Perfect.
And it will go to me and not you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Stacey.